Hi, and welcome to the show where we share the stories of the many who intersect with our healthcare system but are rarely heard from. My name is Kevin Poe, founder and editor of Kevin MD. Today on the show, we have Marc Frost. He is a dermatologist, and he wrote the Kevin MD article, "Thanksgiving came early this year. I just didn't appreciate it." Marc, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Kevin. It's great to be on.
We'll get into your article in a little bit, but first off, can you share your story and your journey to where you are today?
Sure. I grew up in rural Iowa, small town, went to a small college nearby, then went to the University of Iowa for medical school. And as I jokingly would tell patients, I moved to Indiana for the weather, which really I moved there for my residency instead. So I did my dermatology residency at Indiana University Medical School and came to love Indiana. It's the Midwest. As far as Midwest people are great. So I decided to go ahead and as far as stay here, set up practice. Last 32 years practiced solo practitioner and eventually closed my practice and retired in June of this year.
And we are talking towards the end of January in the worst wave of the pandemic. Now, from a dermatology standpoint, tell me what kind of patients you're seeing over the last few months.
Well, since I closed my office practice in June, what I've been doing is seeing nursing home patients about 4 or 5 days a month. And it's a real eye-opener, that obviously these patients, there's a lot of social isolation before COVID. Well, now it's a big deal. There's a lot of people where they're thrilled to see me because I'm the only real person they've seen from the outside in months. For some have not even seen family members. A lot of them, if they leave their facility, they're quarantined for 14 days. So they don't want to leave. They don't have to. So I didn't plan on that as being a big part of as far as my practice when I retired, but there's a big social aspect to it that I've got plenty of time to spend with patients and they like it because it's like one of the very little in-person social interactions they get to have nowadays.
All right, so let's transition now into your Kevin MD article. Thanksgiving came early this year. I just didn't appreciate it. Now, for those who didn't read that story, can you just share it with my audience and share why you decided to write it?
Sure. The inspiration came just before Thanksgiving. So to back up, back in January of 2020, I decided I was going to go ahead and retire, close my practice. No one expected what was going to happen in March. And by the time April 1 rolled around here in Indiana, shut my practice completely. Did some telemedicine that half my staff, I had 4 employees, 2 of them quit because they were worried about getting COVID. There was so much we didn't know about COVID back then. And so they actually quit because they were afraid of contracting it. May rolls around and I had just sent out letters announcing I was going to retire. So there's this massive floodgate of people who want to come in and as far as see me for one last time. And just worked like gangbusters as far as through May and June. We're talking as far as till late at night, finally get done, closed June 30th. During that spell, I had a lot of patients who asked my staff, well, they'd like to get me a retirement gift. And I'm at the point in life where I don't need any more things. So I told them, I'd like just a note or a card. And that, these would come in, but sometimes I'd be busy. I didn't really have time to read them. I kind of take a quick glance at them, tossed them in a file drawer that I had. Well, I also my office building, and when I closed my practice, we put it for sale, and I had to clean it out, and it sold relatively quickly. So brought all these boxes home, and Thanksgiving, my living room is piled up with all these things left over from my office, and I found this box that had all these thank you cards in there, and a lot of them I really had not gone through. So I got one out and read it, and read another one, and read another one. And next thing you know, that after a couple hours, I'd gone through about 400 plus of them. And it was a real eye-opener. It just, during COVID, so busy seeing people, kind of forgot, why you see patients. And people were very, very appreciative. There were a lot of common themes. Some people said how they were my longest surviving patient. That was a joke I always used with them. Not many people end up dying in dermatology. They like to joke about that. Some of them going back to when I started my practice 32 years ago, many who were multi-generational, a lot of patients where I'd seen 4 generations of their family. I had one patient who joked that I was the Mr. Rogers of
Mm-hmm.
dermatology, which I got a kick out of that because as far as that, I thought all along, all the years, I practiced what was the basic minimums people should get in terms of good quality care. And little I realized that people thought that was a pretty big deal.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a real eye opener. And it's something where in your blog, a lot of the articles I read, there's a lot of folks where, there's a lot of frustration out there, a lot of angst. And I think sometimes we kind of lose sight of the fact that we're actually doing a lot of good,
Mm-hmm.
and people actually appreciate that. But just, we get blinded to it. We just don't really realize,
Sure.
what we're doing.
So as you were going through these 400 plus cards and letters, now, did anything surprise you, or did anything that surprised you among those cards?
Probably the biggest surprise was the number of patients who I didn't think liked me and wrote me a card.
Sure.
I was not expecting that. So I think sometimes we kind of judge our interactions with patients and we think, I don't really mesh with that person. They don't really like me, or they don't respect me, or they don't think I know what I'm doing. When the reality is, I think they appreciate that even if they're not getting better, they can still tell you're trying hard to help them.
Mm-hmm.
And that maybe they recognize that maybe they don't mesh with you either, but they still think you're trying to do the best you can for them. So that was probably the biggest surprise, was that there were no patients who I was stunned.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I was actually kind of afraid to open those letters thinking, what were they going to write? And they were generally pretty complimentary. So that was a big surprise.
So after practicing dermatology for 30 plus years, how has the field changed during your time?
Technology is the big one.
Mm-hmm.
And that, even an old fogey like me, you have to learn that, okay, I'm going to learn how to adjust as far as electronic medical records. A lot of video now. I mean, that there was a super learning curve during COVID, those couple months I practiced doing telemedicine. And I think that's going to be a big help to patients down the road, where so many times I would see kids who would go off to college and you want to get some follow-up on how their problem was doing. Or I practiced in a center of the state, and I have some patients who would drive sometimes from several hundred miles away, and there's a big blizzard and they still want to make as far as a follow-up visit. In terms of telemedicine, I think there's a real use for it, in particular in dermatology. Now there's some limitations, where exams are kind of hard, but if you've got kind of a working diagnosis and you've already established some ongoing therapy, I think it's going to be a real boon for a lot of patients who don't have
Mm-hmm.
access, physical access to seeing a doctor.
And what do you see are some of the challenges for dermatology going forward?
Well, it's the same thing. It's
Mm-hmm.
technology. It changes quickly. It's funny that I went ahead and did a Zoom talk with, as far as some pre-med pre-med club at a local high school. And they went ahead and they said, well, what should I major in?
Mm-hmm.
Biology, chemistry? And I said, I said that, computer technology might not be a bad idea,
Mm-hmm.
or computer science. I have a son who is a technology expert for a local energy company here. And he always makes fun of our EMRs because he goes, how can they be so hard to use, so non-intuitive? And I think if we had physicians who actually had training, formal training in computer technology, computer science, I think we could design EMRs that would be useful to us, that we would be very intuitive, that wouldn't be a burden to us, wouldn't be getting in the way between us and seeing patients. So I think as far as that's a big challenge, in that I would welcome, again, seeing them, kids major in things like computer science, computer technology, maybe electrical engineering, things like that, where the technology aspect wouldn't be a big hurdle for them like it would be for me.
So speaking of technology, I see a lot of apps and there are a lot of companies trying to computerize dermatologic diagnoses. You take a picture of a skin lesion and they can use various algorithms to predict what the diagnosis would be. Now, do you see a future for that? And do you also see a place for human dermatologists to continue their role in diagnoses, or do you see technology kind of infringing on that?
That's a great question. And again, going back to when I started doing telemedicine during COVID, you realize, where, where technology is going to be helpful and where there are the big limitations. So I think as far as that, the biggest limitations are making the diagnosis, where one, we're more than just a two-dimensional sort of specialty. It's 3D. We're actually, as far as looking, touching things, and then it's hard to examine the whole patient as far as remotely. So people have limited, straightforward problems. I think it's pretty helpful. Where it wasn't as helpful, and I think there's been a lot of effort looked at it, but we keep running into snags, is going to be diagnosing malignancies. Just too often things that look benign into being malignant and vice versa. So I think there's going to be a lot more effort looking into how we can try to improve that. But I think where it's going to really be helpful is going to be from a screening perspective. For one, we can try to determine, okay, maybe I can't make that diagnosis right there by looking at that, but I think we could go ahead and at least screen who needs to go ahead and be moved up the chain of priority to be seen sooner. And likewise, if there's been treatment established, that I think is going to be helpful from a follow-up standpoint, where we're doing more fine-tuning, and it's not going to be quite as reliant on being able to do a full exam.
Sure. We were talking to Marc Frost. He's a dermatologist, and he wrote the Kevin MD article. Thanksgiving came early this year. I just didn't appreciate it. Marc, so you were in private practice for 30 plus years, and that is actually a minority of physicians. As you know, fewer and fewer physicians are going into private practice, and they're being bought out by private equity, or they're being bought out by larger hospital systems. Now, what are some of the challenges that you faced as a solo private practice practitioner over the last few years?
Well, probably one of the biggest challenges I had over that whole time would be I had the worst boss ever. I'm referring to myself, of course. And that means that you can't wait for someone else to take care of something. I mean, as far as you are the complaint department, and everything has to come back to you as far as your shoulders. The biggest challenge is going to be being able to just keep up with all the changes you've got to do. So you're busy seeing patients during the day, but that means in the evenings, at night, often you're not big enough to have a full-time person who's doing technology stuff. So to be able to not just embrace technology, but to go ahead and to actually implement it, that's I think the biggest challenge when you're a solo practitioner, is just having the time to be able to factor that in.
So if you're a newly graduated dermatologist and you're making the decision about whether to go into private practice versus joining an established large integrated healthcare system, now what are some of the factors that go into that decision-making process in terms of making that right choice for that particular dermatologist?
Well, I think a big part would be as far as your personality type. There are some people who are very entrepreneurial, and they like the idea of running their own show, being their own boss. But like I said, the problem being your own boss is then you have the worst boss possible. That if someone has that sort of mindset, that's a big plus. Yeah, I'm the luckiest guy in the world. Not only did I marry a great person, but as far as my wife is a CPA who specialized in small business development. And so at the beginning, I knew nothing about setting up my own practice, trying to get as far as the word out, as far as the service I offer, things like that. And to have someone there to help kind of guide me along with, how you set up a business, how you apply for a loan, how you write a business plan. I mean, that was a big plus. And so my advice would be, hey, if you didn't marry someone like that, like I did, you're going to need to find someone and hire someone like that. And if you talk to others as far as solo practitioners, they should be able to give you the names of people who can go ahead and get you going, kind of get you past those first big hurdles.
And my final question, what's your take-home message you want to leave with the Kevin MD audience?
Well, my take-home message is that, again, a lot of people write as far as articles that you can tell that there's a lot of frustration, a lot of difficulties ahead of them. And we shouldn't lose sight of what we're trying to do in medicine. We're trying to help people. That's really why most of us went into medicine. And I think if we go ahead and just take the time with each patient visit, say, okay, what did I learn today? What did I learn from this patient? Like, a lot of times I walk out of the room and go, can you believe how lucky I was to get to spend 10, 15, 20 minutes with that person? What a great person that was. And that you actually get to meet a lot of great people over time. You get to establish a lot of great relationships. You get to help a lot of people over time, and that to not lose sight of that. It's really easy to kind of focus on what went wrong today when the reality is you did a lot of good on that given day.
Well, Marc, best wishes on retirement. Thanks again for your time and insight, and thanks again for being on the show.
Great. Thank you, Kevin. It was a great honor.